Hello, everybody. Welcome you back to ITE 1942 ICT Project course module. I am Tushar Silva from University of Moratuwa talking about scope of a project. First, we go and see the learning outcomes of this week. This lesson must be completed successfully, and on successful completion of this lesson, you will be able to define the scope of an ICT project. You can identify your own project, which you should be carried out throughout this course module. Then you need to define the scope of your project. So identify factors that determines the scope of your projects and evaluate thoroughly to get the scope which matches the requirements of this course module. You should be able to define your own chosen projects in terms of scope determinants factor. And this is an individual project. You need to identify all the tasks and functionalities that should be the input as well as output, plus the major processors in your system. Let's go and see what those concepts are. So if we recap from the previous lessons, so we identified what problems can be solvable using a computer program. So we call them programmable problems. We found that there are different types of programmable problems, but remember that there are no predefined standard ways of classifying programmable problems, but based on their level of complexity, we could identify two major categories. And in this lesson, so you are going to identify the scope of your programmable problem, describing task functionalities within the defined scope. First, we will go and see what is an ICT project. This is the course module where you are going to learn about an ICT project. So it's worth investigating what is it? What's an ICT project? What are your answers? It's better to have a look at project first, and then we define it in terms of ICT. What is a project? A project is any undertaking carried out collaboratively, that is by a group of team or individually, and possibly involving design that's carefully planned to achieve a particular aim. So it sounds really complex, but is it so? Let's take any project or any task that can be carried out collaboratively. So that means we group of people get together and solve a project or solve a problem. And we can identify aim of that problem. So what are we going to do? We need to achieve certain aims. So we have to plan for the project. So planning is one of the key areas that you have to master to be successful in ICT projects. So these projects can be conducted individually. So that is called an individual project. So in this course module, you have to do an individual project, not a group project. So in individual project, so what are the key components you have to work on? Of course, there are many different projects which may not be belonging into ICT category. ICT projects are quite different. Why? So we do have to solve a kind of programmable problem. So the output of our project should be a tangible system, a software system. So we should be able to develop a software system. In other words, a software-based solution for the problem that we have identified. So, you know, in order to solve a programmable problem, we have to carefully analyze all the requirements. And based on our requirements, we have to design the solution first. As the final step, only we implement the solution. So these major tasks, major processes needs to be done sequentially. Of course, sometimes we may go back and forward. And then when we move forward and backward, we need to revise our requirements. So, there are different methods of identifying requirements and designing your solutions. Then there are well-defined framework for you to follow. So we are expecting you to follow all these framework in this ICT project course module and identify clearly the problem requirements and develop a solution that meets the requirement. So this is a project, an ICT project, especially why we are going to develop a software-based solution, a software system for the programmable problem. So we know that the programmable problem is there. That means the problem in hand is programmable. So we can develop a software-based solution for that problem. So therefore, this is something doable. It's not so realistic. Last week, we talked about the level of complexity. So moderate level of complexity can be considered in this level. And it's pretty important for you to identify the problem domain. The problem you are going to be chosen, so that can be fallen into any of these categories. So maybe the tourism sector will give us lots of problems to be solved. Products and sales, sales and marketing, banking, telecommunication, education, healthcare, so many more to name. So all these domains have lots of problems which definitely requires a programmable solution. So that means you can develop a software-based solution or software-based systems to solve the existing problem. So remember that I told you the scope should not be pretty high. The scope should represent certain requirements. Let's go and see what those contents are. What do you know about scope of an ICT project? So normally, when we are doing our research projects, so practical problems that we have to solve somewhat have a very big, complex task. So we know that based on the complexity of the problem, it needs a lot of time for us to develop a system, a solution. This course module, ICT project course module is lasting only for a semester. So you do not have such a long period to conduct a research or conduct a project. So therefore, you have to carefully manage your time and choose something that can be doable, which is programmable. The solution is existing, but you cannot have simple set of functionalities. So that should reflect kind of complex functionalities as well. So when you're identifying the scope, it's pretty important for you to identify the scope determinant factor. The complexity can be seen as one of those factors. Okay, so then we can determine the scope of a project in terms of the complexity of a programmable problem. How complex it is. So we found that the functionalities can be identified inside the project domain. So different functionalities. Based on the complexity of functionality, right, we can determine the scope of the project. So we can identify actually if we have lots of complexity in terms of functionalities, then we have a big scope in the project. So again, to solve that big problem, we do need a lot of time. So therefore, then highly complex functionalities are not supposed to be included. Number of complex functionalities will also be able to determine the project scope. So scope will be varying based on the number of complex functionalities. So now here you found a few concepts. Complex functionalities, nature of the functionality, whether they are simple or moderately complex or complex. It's very complex. Or maybe number of complex functionalities in your project. So we talk about the qualitative factor plus quantitative factors. So both quantitative measures that such as how many complex functionality, how many functionalities are there, we are going to talk about a measurements, how. Okay, and answers you say 2 complex functionalities, or you say there are 3 functionalities in my project. So it's a quantitative measurement. So that is called the quantitative measure. Okay, so in other words, we also have qualitative measures. Quality, we determine how complex, how good, how challenging the system is, or how challenging the problem is, how. So then when answering such questions, you have to say, okay, so it's relative answers. It's quite complicated. It's very complicated. Okay? So those measurements are qualitative measures. So then we can use both type of measures to judge the scope of a project. Especially in your domain, we are talking about ICT projects. Scope of an ICT project need to be determined by considering either quantitative or qualitative measures. Let's dig into deep and find out what those measures are. So when we are determining the scope of an ICT project, we need to identify first the task in hand. What do we have to do? What are the project goals? What are we going to provide? Are we going to talk about a set of strategies? Or are we going to give a solution or develop a hardware or software? Are we going to generate certain results based on a study we did? So what is the goal? What is the outcome? To meet the aim, that is called aim. Meet this aim, we do need to identify what are the major activities we do have to do. So then that comes the number of processes or major processes and their complexity, how complex the processes are. Each process might contain multiple subtasks or sub-processes. So in that sense, we do have to talk about, we have tasks, how complicated the tasks are. And also we do have to understand the resources. What do we need to solve this problem? Do you need a computer? Do you need a pen or paper? So whatever you do need, right? So you should use it. Okay? When you use those resources, then it's easy for you to identify a solution and develop a solution as well. So it's pretty sure that when we come to the ICT project, our resources should be related to computer hardware and software. We don't talk about we do need A4 bundles and we do need this much of pens, we do need rulers and not those materials we are interested in. Of course, we do need it to write something, but here when we try to identify scope, okay, do I have this software? Do I have this sort of resources to solve that particular problem? I do have to locate GPS location. So do I have required devices? If you don't have devices, you cannot get GPS locations. If you can't get GPS locations, your inputs are not there, then how do you solve your problem? So that is pretty much important that at the moment you are defining your problem, you do have to identify the types of resources. In terms of ICT projects, so it's pretty important to frame the scope. The scope should be ICT project. So nothing else. There are many projects, medical projects, and also other social science projects. So which is totally engineering projects. We are not talking about them. The resources they want and the methodologies they follow and they need, what they need and what they use are totally different from our scope, our domain. So therefore, you do have to fit into the frame, which is an ICT project. So once you identify the project, the problem, let's say that I want to develop a system to track the patients in my ward or in my hospital. So as a doctor wants to record about all the patients and for what diseases they are coming here for, and if they are hospitalized, for how long will they be hospitalized, so what is the nature of the disease, and so on, many more details. So that's a nice project, and doctor might approach you and ask, hey, can you guys please develop a system for me? That's an ICT project. Okay, so ICT projects, you are developing a project, you are developing a system for a hospital. So that's healthcare related domain. So in that situation, you know, my aim is to develop a system to record or maintain patients or manage patients. So patient management system is the outcome of my project. So that is the goal. And what are the major processes are there? Yes, of course, I have to register patients and I have to record the doctors who will be channeling or visiting those patients, consultations, and maybe their disease or the reports that they got, and their results. So everything I do have to record. So you may dig into the problem. Once you dig in, you can find a lot of major processes are there. So are you going to develop all these processes that you might find? No, not necessary. So that limits the scope of our ICT projects. So first you have to identify major processes, 3 to 4 processes. Okay, based on their complexity, you have to increase the number. If the processes are there, then but they are not so complex, then you should have to have kind of complex processes. Or maybe merging 2 processes into one big process might be helpful. And each process, let's say the patient registration system, so there you have to identify subtasks. So you have to register each and every patient. So in that case, you have to record their name, age, and other related information, plus the nature of the disease and how frequently he or she is having this disease. Okay, what sort of medication have been prescribed, so prescription details and how frequent these things are occurring. So lots of subtasks can be thought of. The resources, you saw that it's not just a paper or pencil, but it is a computer with a computational power to record your information and develop or download or install all the software features and use them. So therefore, there's a big thing going on under that ICT project. And deliverables, of course, very prominent deliverable here is the system, patient management system. So it's up to you now. You have to identify a particular project and you have to determine these factors. So what is the goal of my problem? What is the project? What's the goal of the project? What are the major processes? You take a pen and paper and write that down first, or maybe use your word editor. Task, identify the task, or maybe use your software. Any software that you can use can be used here. Resources, what do I need? So it's important for you to identify these scope determinant factors first. And based on these factors, we can identify the proper scope for the project that you have to carry it out as a part of or requirements of this ICT project course module. So let's have, I gave you an example, and now we are going to see what each and every factors represent or determinant represent. Project goal. Project goal indicates what the software-based solution provides. What does it provide? And if you can identify, okay, at the end of the project, I'm going to deliver this sort of student management system to you. So what the solution provides? A student management system. So then in that situation, you have to take, the goal is to design and develop a software management system. Okay, it's not, the goal should not be solving how to handle patients. Okay, so solution should be bringing forward, and that is the goal of the project. Then we determine the major processes. What are major processes? So major components of your solution. When it comes to student management systems, we earlier found that one of the processes is registering students, student registration. So maybe fees handling. Okay, so that sort of major activities, not just typing details about or entering email about students. Entering email is a simple task. So no, don't need to go in that detail, right? Go down and find out the major small things, but you have to identify the major processes. So that's why major processes, okay, major task. Right, not typing the full name of a student. You have to type or you have to enter. That is not a big deal. But big deal is the registration of a student. So processes should be the registration of a student, payment handling of that student, generating reports by the end of the semester, grade reports or performance reports or other payment receipts, something, including everything. Okay, so that is the process. So task, then again, you have to talk kind of middle level. Okay, not go down, don't go down. Identify a very single task, collect student email. It's not an important, it's a subtask, it's very small task. You don't put big weight at the top level. Okay, then here you have to identify several tasks of your processes. Plus the resources. Resources completes the infrastructure facilities which are required for the development of the solution. Okay, not to do anything else, but you need this sort of machines or this type of software, this type of hardware devices for developing the solution. So that is the focus comes in. Therefore, it's pretty important to highlight that what does ICT project need? So generally for an ICT project development, you do need to have a computer, software, hardware, or the server or internet connections or that sort of things you can claim here. Okay, so now these determinant factors are pretty important to judge or determine the scope of your project. Once you have identified them clearly, you can easily determine the scope of your project. Let's talk more about the deliverables. Deliverables basically covers what would you deliver throughout planning, designing, and development phases of the project. You might have heard about system requirement statements, or maybe you are going to learn it during next year, level 2. So there you may talk about the system requirement statement. So full report which comprise of all the requirements of your clients and what sort of designing strategies followed and who are the users and what are their connections, how do they interact with the system, so how did you design your database, covering entire thing. So that will be a deliverable, but not at the end of the project, at the beginning stage of the project. Or sometimes during the middle, so you may give a prototype system for the client. When you give a prototype system, so that means just a sample of the original system. So that will be a kind of deliverable. So when we have that sort of deliverables, at the end, of course, you have to deliver something tangible. That is your software system. Okay, so but certain things you can deliver on hardware. You might find that in real life, some projects have as a result, okay, of the project, so they deliver a device. So that's a hardware component, maybe a software can be a part of it. Okay, so it depends on your applications. I do not want to dig into such a big project, but I want you to deliver simple software components. Okay, I can see some functionalities in your project software, and then I can see they are working. That's a complex logic behind it. So that remarks the scope of your project. And so now you have identified those scope determinant factors. So based on these complex number of functionalities, as well as the specific goals and the task and the complexity of the task, a number of complex tasks. So these quantitative and qualitative measures will be helpful in determining the scope of your project. Project scope should definitely be developed and determined based on these determinant factors. So the first step you have to do is identify your problem. You identified your problem, and then you have to identify these determinant factors: goal, and then major processes, complex task, resources, plus deliverables. And once you have them in hand, then you can carefully analyze how complicated your processes are. They are very complicated, and there are lots of processes that you cannot solve during the specified time limit. So better not to go there. Better not to go there. Now carefully look at this scenario one. So I'll read it out. Assume that you have been hired as a consultant by a leading education institute in Sri Lanka. So your client is clear, that's a leading education institute in Sri Lanka. Probably he needs something to manage his academic related matters plus admin related matters. They are handling multiple courses, example, BCS professional examinations, Association of Chartered Certified Accountants as an examination, and as a consultant, you need to work on a project which focuses on developing a software-based solution for handling student registration and their payment details. So scenario is familiar to us. So we have looked at it before, but we relook at it in terms of project scope. Here, the problem you are going to address as a consultant is how to handle student registration and their payment details effectively and efficiently. So that's the problem. What's the problem? This education institute does not have an efficient or effective mechanism to handle their registration, student registrations, and the payment history. So that's a problem for us to solve. We know that computers can be used to generate efficient and effective solutions. So when we use a computer to do many tasks, right, it's much faster than when we do it manually. For an example, think about going to a bank and withdrawing money using a slip, which is available at a counter. So you wait in a queue and you fill your slip and wait till your turn comes, and then you give it to the banker available at the counter, and then that banker will certify it and do necessary changes to your account and give you money back. How long that process is? Is it easy? Waiting in a queue and withdrawing money, filling slips, right? It's not so comfortable, not easy. That's our world way. Now, thanks to computers, thanks to these ICT related projects, we do have online banking. So that's a project, online banking. So here our problem is different. We do have to record everything in computer-based solution or computer-based system. What are the records? Not about money withdrawal or money deposits, here about student registrations and their payment details. So when we have student registrations and payment details recording system, so this education institute in Sri Lanka will be able to give their service faster than the earlier. So they can easily track people who have paid already, or track the others who did not pay and didn't make the required notification on time. And if system can track those people, so they will be easily notified, not like they have to go through the manual records, which has been marked on books and analyzed one by one. So that comes the efficiency. Effectiveness comes when we have a very correct or complete system. Very correct when we say, okay, these students are registered for this class, yes, it is true. There are no malfunction statements. Everything is effective and efficient. So that is the solution they are waiting for. So your problem is to handle student registrations and payment data. So our problem is, what's the scope of this project? So can we solve this sort of problems in this course module? Let's find the answer. Current education system follows a manual process. Yes, our guessing is perfect. They follow a manual process with record all details on papers and files them for future reference. Oh, so bad. So what if this pandemic situation affect this institute in Sri Lanka? Can they serve better than earlier? No, because they have to carry all these records in their vehicles. So hectic. So, but carrying a one single laptop or pen drive, which carries everything, will be more smarter than that. So let's develop some smart solutions, so which are very efficient and effective. So leading education institute in Sri Lanka will be very happy to receive it. So the scenario is clear to us. Let's go and study. We'll answer these questions first. The first question: can you develop a software system to automate tasks in scenario 1? Yeah, we discuss it. We can design and develop a system. We have to design it. Systems are not quickly made out of the software codes. But you have to carefully plan it. You have to determine who are the users, how many users are there. Can students get all the details about registrations, payments, and everything from the system? So we have to be very careful when we are giving more data to the others. Security will be very. So managing roles, determining who are the administrators and who are the clerks. And this is a kind of very complicated, this kind of moderately complex, not very complicated, of course, because we have very limited functionalities, kind of moderately complicated problem. So when we have those sort of processes, so we do have to carefully analyze one by one. We do not want to put all into one big problem and say, this is the process in my course, that is registration and payment details handling process. So that is too broad. We don't break processes that way. So we have this level of complexity of this project is moderate, and we can develop a software system to facilitate this requirement. Efficient and effective student registration and payment handling mechanism. Yes, so there is a solution that comes in handy way, saying student registrations and payment management system or student management system. Okay, if you are having a thought of increasing or expanding their services in the future, you can put a big title. But if you're focusing only these two, you may limit to these two functionalities only at the moment. The next question, can this be treated as an ICT project? If yes, why? Why do we have to categorize this project as an ICT project? So the answer is, if we go back, we can see when we see the problem, right? So the institute is following a manual process which records all the details on papers and file them for future reference. So this is completely a manual process. To improve the efficiency, you have to automate some tasks, right? How do we automate? By developing a software to record student registration. So we are entering student details and identifying courses they are registering for, because this particular institute has lots of examination. When we are going through the scenario, we found that BCS professional examination, ACC examinations, and many more are part of this. So therefore, we do have to register student for specific exam or course. And we know that, okay, so software systems are quite capable of automating these sort of tasks. Okay, we can fill a nice form and click submit, and then it's gone to the database, it's recorded, and it can be kept there forever. So this is very efficient. When you want it, you can take it back and write a simple query, so display. So that's a doable task. So you know that all the main thing I mentioned, it involves terms related to software development. Okay, software developments are basically carried out under this project. So this is a typical ICT project that you can think of. What are the scope determinant factors of this case? What is the goal? In my explanations, I already have mentioned that. The goal is to design and develop. Okay, you don't have just to develop, but you have to design it first. Okay, so carefully add those two terms in your aims when you are writing the proposal. Okay, so design and develop a student management system. So student management system is a broad topic. So under student management systems, we have to manage student registration, student payments, student examination performance, many more. Right, so the umbrella term for this solution can be a student management system. Right, the major processes we understood. Okay, so we have one end a student registration system, the other end payment detail system. So what about the resources? Resources, of course, we do need a kind of computer with dual core, maybe high processing power. So you may judge, or maybe you do need a kind of nice handy laptop, or RAM 8 GB, okay, or more. Okay, so if you want more data to be stored, so your hard disk must be, hard drive should be having enough capacity to that. And then internet server, so if you want to search or develop certain things, so many things you can claim under this, but don't claim pen and papers. Okay, so what are major processors in this scenario? Major processors are, so when we talk about major processors, you have to be very careful because the scenario itself gives us big hint. Okay, big hints about what we should have to include under processors. So what do they want? They want student registration process plus payment details handling process. So two major processors, don't merge them together because they are two independent sources, independent big processors. Okay, of course, student has to be registered before paying, okay, right? So that dependency is there, but payment details handling, whether student paid on time and how many courses has the student registered for, and every details we should be able to get instantly. Okay, don't wait. We cannot wait, okay, wait, I will go through the files and tell you. No, we cannot give those sort of answers. Very quickly, they should be able to get the answers. So that is efficiency. And when we don't have this scenario in hand, then we go and think about the task. What task? Under each and every process, you can define set of tasks. Let's say student registration process. So under student registrations, you have to record details about students and make sure that you are entering validation inputs, right? Input validation. You are entering correct input to the system. So you have a database underneath. So if you put wrong data, your database is going very funny, right? So it will not be used with your system. So therefore, you cannot feed wrong information to the database. So you have to put kind of very consistent and atomic data units. So you learned all these things under your data management course. So it's time for you to bring that up and use it in this project. So some tasks, if you think about the other module, like identifying the payment details or managing payment details of students. So in that module, you do have to talk about the payment history. Are there any pending payments? Who will be? Who will be the students needs notification, so who are missing it out? So what sort of notification needs to be sent out? So those things you do have to think of. So subtasks are there, right? The task complexity again determine how big your project is. Okay, so don't imagine or don't dream for a very big project that you cannot do throughout this limited time period, but think about a nice project that is sufficient enough to meet the minimum requirements of this course module. So like I mentioned, so two major processes are handling student registrations and handling students' payment details. So I have listed down some of the tasks that might be coming under the student registrations. Of course, you might think of many more. So with this one, I may list down several, like which program that the students are registering for. You do need to record that one. And also what are the courses that students are taking under given program. So there are multiple exams and some courses. So under these exams, what particular course that they want to take. Or the lecturers or teachers, are there any practice going on? And then we do have to talk about this lecturers and teachers as well. In addition to that, you may need to know about which classes they are registering for, which exams. Are they going to take both exams at once? Or are they registering for both classes? Or maybe many more examination at once. So you have to carefully handle all these things because timetabling requires this sort of information. So it must be carefully stored, and designing is taking an important role here. Once you design, you have to store there. That's part of implementation. Design must be done by considering all these requirements and future activities. So the second process, handling students' payment details. Some may include who has paid course fees and examination fees, who do need more time, okay, and also whether it's available in installments, payment mechanisms, or can we pay some installments before the examination classes begins, and after that several other payments can be made in between. Is that the package provided by the institute? So you may need to think about all these scenarios. So once you have identified all the factors very carefully, so I told you that design aspect is pretty important. So that is a part of determining processes as well as the task. So what sort of designing factors? We have to store details about students in a database. We may need to check whether are there any vacant places in the class. You know, some classes are limited. So limited number of students will be registered only for those specific classes. So then have you reached the maximum limit? Are there any vacant places? So that must be readily available at the entrance. So the database, your system should be freely available for them to get such information. So you have to provide a way to provide those information and managing payment records, who paid what and when, and current history of payments, and anybody who missed out or anybody who missed the class completely or left you, and also the sharing information among the rightful users, the management of roles. So you can see that even your scenario is carrying only few sentences, but when you try to model this using an ICT project and also try to identify several processes plus the task, so you can see how complex the system is. Okay, when you make one condition a variable, so it adds more complexity to your system. So for an example, if you decide that there will be only examination in your system, so things are pretty easy for you. But if you say there can be any number of examinations and these examinations will be taken place in different years, time of the year, so then that your situation, your requirement is quite complicated. Okay, so identify very carefully what the system you want to develop and what is the goal and what is the process, major processes and tasks and the deliverables and the resources. Okay, so everything should be written down very clearly. So once you have written them down, you can easily identify the scope. So let's talk about the goal of this scenario. So what's the goal? We found that the goal is design and develop student management system. So what's the scope of any ICT project which must be conducted as a requirement of this ITE 1942 course module? When you are determining goal, you should not focus on very, very simple programming problems. For an example, your goal cannot be generating sum of any two given numbers, a system to generate addition. That is too simple, right? You don't need much time to do that. 1 single hour would be very sufficient for you to develop that system. So that is not sufficient for ICT project course module. So you do have to focus on very, very simple, you should not have to focus on very, very simple programmable problems. You have to think of programmable problems which are at moderate complex level. Okay, so I'm not restricting you to do highly complex projects, but if you are capable enough, yes, you have the freedom to go, but we do not expect that thing at this level. And major processors, how many processors you must define is very complex, kind of complex, 3 to 5 processors. So numbers depends on how complex your processors are. If they are quite complicated, right, when you're like earlier cases, when you write down all the aspects you have to look into, and you see that it's a kind of moderate level complexity. So this sort of complexity levels are expected for several processors in your system. Of course, it must have some simple processors as well. So I'm not asking you to remove all simple processors from your system, but I'm asking you to add 3 to 5 complex processors. The main processor should be kind of complicated, like patient record handling system. So you have to register patients, or maybe e-channeling system. So there you have to manage appointments. You have to check whether the available hours, available places, okay, for a particular physician. And then based on that, the availability needs to be displayed and recorded. So once the appointment is made, you have to update the availability. So that's a kind of complicated process. So you can think of such processes. So your system or the problem should have at least 3 to 5 complex main processes. That's the project. Then definitely when the process is complicated, you can define several subtasks. Subtask definition should be a part of this process identification. Make sure that as long as you write down a project goal, and then that means you know what the solution is and identify major parts of your solution. Right? So once you identify parts of your solution, then you can identify subparts of your solution. Those subparts are called tasks. When we have tasks, when we have processors, so that means major components, and when we know the solution, what should I develop? So the deliverables are in your hand. So on the deliverables, right? So you can specify this is what I was expecting. So let's look at another activity here. So that is, I will read it out first and then let's find solution to this together. Library management system is a project which aims in developing a computerized system to maintain all the daily work of a library at school. So the task is to do what? So that's a task. You have to highlight that word. Maintain all the daily works of a library at school. So when we have this sort of information in your scenario or the problem that you found, then you know that maintaining daily work of a library is a kind of challenging thing. The system helps both students and librarians to keep constant track of all the books available in a library. It allows the student to search for the desired book. So searching has been provided in addition to traditional insert, delete, update tasks. So you better think about some more advanced concepts. So not simply addition, deletions, and insertions will be giving you very complex approaches. But when you try to insert some kind of searching or the fine computations or finding out who are the booked books who are waiting for, Okay, so when we know that if somebody has preserved a book, if the book is not in the library, if the book is with particular borrower, so you can send reminders when the high time comes for the book to be returned. Because if the book is waiting, a big book is demanded by multiple borrowers, so better you take the book to the library and give it to another user. So that sort of things you do need to think of. The main feature of this system is that all the books available in the library can be displayed in a list, so that students need not to roam around the entire library to find a book. Additionally, the application effectively maintains the details of students to whom books have been issued. It also records the issue date and return date. So more additional informations are there, right? So then you know the borrower. When the borrower comes, borrower has to mark the issue date and marks the return date. If the return days have been passed, and then definitely the borrower has to make particular fines. So then we also know that fines will also be calculated by the system. So this system is pretty advanced, pretty good, right? Not a simple system, but it is a moderate level system again. So what are the goals of this library management system project? So they have to, so see that they have to develop a library management system, right, to the school library. Okay, the computerized system to manage library actions. We can simply call it to develop, right? The library management system which facilitates all maintenance of all the daily tasks. So that means borrowing and also calculating fines, identifying which books. Okay, searching functionalities can also be included. So that's the goal. So full-fledged library management system. The list main processors in the project. So the first thing is the borrower's point of view. So you can think about borrowing books can be facilitated, and searching books will also be a subpart. Adding new books to the library can also be there. Fine computation, so will also be another process. So among those processors, so you have to identify what are the main processors. So of course, registering a borrower or a user, so that will be a big task, and adding details of the book to the author, so that will also be another big task, and calculating fines based on the issue date, return date, and determining the books which are needed most. So those are major processes. But of course, marking or generating notifications based on the end date or return date. Okay, so that will not be a major process. It can be a subpart of it. Right, so some might think that fines calculation will not be so challenging. Yes, if you just give the only 2 dates, return dates and that date, so there will not be a big thing. But if you think that kind of first few days you have to pay this much, and then after 1 week, so you have to pay a big fine. And if the book is most demanding, for ignorance of the notifications, you have to pay something more. That kind of breaking down can be taken place. So it's a kind of complicated task in a main process. Okay, so you may analyze some decisions are kind of subjective, but make sure that you have sufficient number of processors in your system. And then under each and every process, so maybe book return will be the major process. When returning book, you may calculate the fine will be a subtask. Okay, subtask and functionality under each and every process. So returning a book will be one thing, or the borrower's job, or the registration process, registering students, plus the others, teachers may need to use the library. So for them, maybe the dates of returns can be different, but not normal users. So they are teachers in the school. Okay, so they need a book for a semester. So, or maybe more than that. So therefore, you may define for specific roles, for them different conditions can be implemented. So now next one is to determine whether the library management system project is having an acceptable scope. Yes, it is. It is having an acceptable scope because it has basically major processes. So registering students and borrowers section and searching, so that can be more advanced, right? Searching not just records in the library, okay, the database, but also finding out the nearby places and give the details about the nearest location where the user can find the book. Okay, so that search can be complicated. So in that case, searching can be a new process, but if you try to limit the task that the search function must do just to get details only from the database, it must be a subtask or the functionality in one of major processes. Okay, so then again, you have the freedom to identify the scope of your projects. You can see that how complex task can be or how simple the same task can be. So based on the simplicity as well as the complexity, different sort of task processes and sub-processes, main processes can be derived. So based on that identification of the goal, deliverables, resources that you want to implement a solution, and plus task and major processes, you will be able to identify the scope which is suitable for this course module. So I know that you are now in a position to identify your own problem and define the scope which is suitable for this course module. So make sure that your solution needs to contain at least 3 to 5 major processes, inside it some complex tasks. Okay, so object should be very clear, the goal should be very clear, and designing requirements should carefully be handled. So in summary, what did we learn in this week? We learned about the project scope, and we saw the difference between a project and an ICT project. We identified the scope plus the way to determine the scope. We identified scope determinant factor. For every simple project, so any ICT project, we can identify those determinant factors. Based on that, we analyze how a given project can be analyzed to determine the scope, or in other terms, the determinant factors. And then we identified how big the project is or how simple, or else how complex, how moderately complex, or very complicated. Now it's high time for you to start on your own projects and identify goals, deliverables, major processes, tasks, and resources. So then you will be able to define the scope of your project. That brings to the end of this session. Thank you very much for being with me. I'll see you again in the next lesson. Thank you.